Hey guys, so today we'll be continuing on with mid-game techniques part 2. So today we'll be covering another set of 3 commonly seen mid-game techniques that could perhaps help your game. And of course, the next few episodes will still continue to focus on mid-game techniques so that you know the common variations and how to handle them. So hopefully you enjoy this episode. So, before we move on to the topics for today, I'd like to talk about this background in the picture. So, this is Stockholm Castle. So, I think one of the coolest venues that the World Othello Championship has ever been played was actually within a castle at Stockholm. So, I think that was one of the World Championship that I did not get to attend, but would have really loved to attend based on how great the atmosphere was playing an Othello championship within a very nice and classic looking castle. So I think one of the interesting things about participating at the World Othello Championships is that they often bring you to many different interesting parts of the world to actually enjoy different culture as well as while you are there playing your tournaments for your country. So let's move on to the topics for today. So today's topics are going to be about feed and pull, feed and poison or unpoison, and feed and control. So when I talk about control here, it's more about line control. So let's move on to the first topic. So let's now talk about feed and pull. So in Othello, you typically get two major different types of game situations going on. Either you have a group of discs that are really clear cut between the boundaries on the board between black and white, like the current situation as per below, or you get a bunch of discs that are intersecting one another or nestled amongst one another, and that would really be a very complicated game as compared to a very simple game. So I think for beginners and intermediate players, the chances are that you like simple boundary games because it's easier to understand the game and also easier for you to actually have sort of like a tug of war with your opponent to just try to pull them to your side. And also, ultimately, if you're able to make moves and exchange tempo up to a certain point whereby you're forcing your opponent to the corner 4 squares of each corner and force them to play a c square and x square, and then the most straightforward method for you would be to actually just simply capture the corner and just gain as many stable discs as possible from there. So in this situation, I'd like to talk about feed and pull. So in this situation whereby it's a very simple game whereby black is having occupying most of the boundary on the left of the whole group of discs, and right side is actually occupied by white. It's typical that you would like to find moves to actually pull your opponent to your side of the board as much as possible. So in this situation here, to pull off what I like to call a feed and pull is to play c2. So c2 basically forms up sort of like a mid-game pair on these two squares, c3 and c4. And basically there is no way that white can actually pull back to his side of the board unless white chooses to play just e8, which is an entire sweep of one whole column of discs. So this feed and pull maneuver is actually just a simple maintaining the boundary kind of maneuver. So over here you have a pair c3 and c4 after playing c2. White doesn't have a free move to c1. So wherever white plays, be it c3 or c4, black can just simply cover up the other square. So it's more like a feed white a move to c3 or c4 and just continue to pull white across to your left hand side boundary without making more moves to white's right hand side boundary. So you want to preserve as many moves as you can on the top right and also maybe to the bottom in the future for yourself. So this is the feed and pull maneuver. And of course, if you argue that maybe white can jump into c4, black can just simply take c3 because white c4 would be in effect capturing d4 in order to pull back and regroup to f2. So instead of allowing him to pull back to f2, you just simply play a c3 compact maneuver, flip three discs in three different directions. However, because you know that this is a game or a board situation that is split by boundary, what you really want is to just kind of pull white over to your side. So it doesn't really matter if you're flipping three discs in three different directions, even though typically it's not a great move by definition. But for this situation, it's perfectly fine because all along black has been occupying the entire left-hand side boundary. So that's perfectly fine to actually form a compact shape and at the same time removing white's key excess at d4 that provides access for white to regroup at f2. So that, in essence, is the feed and pull maneuver. So if we just go back to the earlier situation over here, if you were to play something else, like let's say c3, this allows white to play a very simple and nice c2 quiet move. And then you realize there is no way that black can regroup nicely back to c4 because white is controlling these two discs to e2 and d3, which is like a mini diagonal line control. And of course, if you were to try to create access for yourself by playing e1, you give up a very nice balanceable edge for white to capture to f1. So a balanceable edge, of course, if you were to play this in the future and white grabs g1, and if you play c1, white grabs b1, that would just form up a very nice 6-disc balance edge for white. And without you gaining tempo, it would be tough for you to chase down that excess. And let's say if you were to adopt that approach and just try to chase for the excess by playing f2, you would be sort of on a wild goose chase whereby you finally created the excess on e2 in order to capture c4, but white has a quicker access than you to actually just jump right into c4 to just grab that position. And then suddenly you realize you're out of position because you've just tried too hard to actually chase after the excess. So that is also one of the reasons why c3 is not as favored as c2 in the earlier position over here. So a little bit more, of course, if you were to consider moving to c1 following white c2 over here, white would simply just jump in for an easy c4, a quiet move, flipping one disc in one direction with the existing disc on the board surrounding the disc that you flip, and at the same time creating that d4 excess, which gives white a very nice regroup move to f2, and it's something that you no longer can remove even if you were to play b3, and this entire row is controlled by white. So in essence, it's important to actually take note of such a situation whereby you have sort of like maybe two choices between c2 and c3, maybe even c1, and you really need to know, there is a very significant difference between playing c2 and also c3 because of the objectives that you're trying to achieve over here. So of course, in this situation, it's all about feeding and pulling. So you form a pair, you feed this pair over, and you just try to bring the entire board across. And of course, if white were to choose to form an entire plane over here, just to create a boundary, that would be flipping too many discs at once, and at the same time, it opens up opportunities for black to just play maybe f1 or even f7 perhaps. So that is basically the feed and pull maneuver. Now let's talk about feed and poison, or unpoison. So in episode 14, we talked about one of the mid-game principles that you can actually look at is to actually poison your opponent. So poison, basically, just a quick recap, means making a particular move that was attractive for your opponent into something that is unattractive, perhaps. So in this situation right now, it's white's turn to play, and you can see that after the exchanges to the bottom and to the right, black is actually having one very nice move to actually play to g3 in the form of a quiet move. And of course, preventing it would probably mean playing to either b8 or c8. So these moves may be a bit risky in the form of b8, as that's quite an early attempted line control on the c column, which is easily reversed by black intersecting that column by playing maybe to d2 or f2. And of course, if you were to play c8, black could still retain that access towards g3 by extending to b8, or just cross back to e8. So that's not something we want to do at this point in time. Over here on the right, you could choose to actually take the move itself, but if you choose to take the move to g3 itself, you flip 3 discs in 2 different directions, and at the same time, you close off the regions and allow black to just form up a balance edge, after which you still have to actually break to the bottom. So one way you can do to actually feed and poison and make this move entirely unattractive is to actually simply play a4, which is the benefit of having such a shape, whereby black has 3 discs unbalanced edge and you actually have 1 disc that is in a equilibrium edge that you can actually always choose to actually just fire a trigger or pull the trigger on black. So in this situation here, white can actually just pull the trigger on black, play a4, force the access to corner a8, in which black would definitely have to defend to a2 if he doesn't want to lose too quickly. So if black defends to a2 and takes a2, a3 and b3 disc essentially becomes black. And thereafter, you can then play something like f2, which essentially connects the region from these 2 discs, a3 and b3 discs. And suddenly, black cannot play g3 so nicely because on top of flipping the 3 nice discs that are nestled within the existing disc, black has to flip 4 more discs on the 3rd row that opens up a nice move for you to d2. So let's just go back to the earlier position over here. So over here, if white were to just simply play f2, black would have gained a very nice quiet move to g3, flipping 3 discs in a single direction and not creating any more useful moves for white. But instead of allowing black to actually do that, you could first establish the poison, play to a4, almost like a combo move, a forced move, forcing black to actually respond to a2, and then white jumps into f2, and suddenly g3 is entirely unattractive and therefore poisoned. So this presents black with a huge dilemma and hard to advance, and instead white can then progress with forcing and pulling black to the top and trying to basically gain as many moves as possible before just trying to close out the game in a simple fashion. So that essentially is feed and poison. Let's talk about feed and unpoison next. So let's now talk about feed and unpoison. So in this situation over here, it's now white's turn to play. And of course, I think white is definitely ahead over here. But the next dangerous move for black to actually play right now would be for black to continue on to a6. And of course, white wouldn't be able to remove the E1 disc, the E2 disc that is actually contributing to A6 access for black. And at the same time, white cannot take the move or poison the move. So, because if white were to jump right into B6 over here, this would form a consecutive row on the 6th row of this, whereby black can still take a nice quiet move to A6. So, over here we want to talk about feeding and unpoisoning, and at the same time also poisoning your opponent. So over here you have a nice trigger feed, just to pull the trigger at h5, force a move in black as to respond to h7. And over here you realize that due to that feed and response by black, a forced feed, black has converted essentially the G6 and G6 and H6 disc to black. And suddenly this becomes a quiet move, which essentially is now unpoisoned for white to play a very nice B6 move, flipping only 1 disc in a diagonal direction, and at the same time kind of poison the black original A6 move that was nice. So this essentially is feed and unpoison, but in this case, at the same time, also poisoning your opponent's move. So this would be an excellent maneuver to actually pull off as part of a mid-game technique. So let's just go back to the earlier position over here. So if white would just simply take this, it would be a move that is unattractive and poisoned, flipping 5 discs in 2 different directions, and at the same time giving black a nice quiet a6. But instead, what you could perhaps consider is to just play h5 and force black to respond. Because if black were to take a6 over here, you would simply capture the corner. So force black to respond over here, unpoison b6 move, and then carry on from here to wrap up the game. And this is right now poison. So if black were to just simply take this, white jumps in, black seals off, and essentially you realize that black doesn't have much moves to play with. Finally, we come to feed and control. So over here in this situation, it's quite a typical situation that you find yourself if or against Tanida opening, where you're playing against a diagonal opening and you're playing a cow to Tanida. So over here, something that is really interesting for black is that white is actually threatening to jump over here to d6 for the next move. But right now it's black's turn to play. You're definitely going to end up slower than white actually accessing to d6, since white already has an irremovable disc to d1 that is pointing right straight into d6. So instead of just trying to go for maybe something that is g3 that is trying to point excess towards d6, which will definitely be too slow, what you could do is actually do a feed and line control. So how does this work? It's almost like a cross, forming a cross. So over here, black would actually start off the maneuver with g6. So this is somewhat working around the anticipated move of white going into d6. So when black plays to g6 to actually feed this easy move for white to g5, or potentially white jumping in to d6. Both are simple moves. So if white were to jump in to g5, black would essentially jump right in with the disc that he's created at g6 into d6. And of course, if white were to jump in for the cross over here, white wouldn't want to play d7 because this gives up a very simple move to f7 for black. So instead, white may consider to actually play f7, in which you realize that after this exchange of a couple of moves, the next few intersections is likely to occur in a diagonal or a horizontal manner. So in this case, black can then jump into h5 and do a line control. This mini diagonal line control can be actually very strong for black to actually obtain lots of tempo and at the same time maneuver white into certain unbalanced edges. So let's move back to the earlier situation. Let's say if white didn't actually play g5 and instead white chose to play d6. Black can then choose to play f7 still and form up a very nice cross. So if you look at this particular cross structure on over here and here, you can see this mini cross that has been formed. And you will realize that if white were to try to look for excess to actually jump into d7, which would be a great move for white, white may choose to actually play g5. And again, black can still maintain that line control by playing to h5 and still maintaining this mini diagonal line control. And that basically forces white to maybe compromise to actually play to f8, and black can then continue to actually play either to the top right or to the bottom left. So this essential line control ensures that black remains in control and maintains that key tempo advantage that he has against white. So if we just go back to the earlier structure, this is essentially what I like to call the feed and control maneuver, whereby you basically feed and you eventually arrive at a line control of sorts this way. Or if white takes the feed, you jump in and exchange that tempo across and you still get the line control. So with that, we basically wrap up today's episodes with the 3 key mid-game techniques of the mid-game technique part 2. And I look forward to you joining me in the next episode. Thank you very much for your support as always, and I'll see you in the next one.